I'm always going to be particularly grateful to Pear for trusting me with a collaborative project here, an activity there over the years. For the last 15 or 20 years, Pear has given me opportunities to do things at IFPRI and elsewhere that I know might have been a bit risky for him to offer, because I'm a bit of an outsider. I'm not an economist. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm a lesser breed. I'm a political scientist. And so Pear was taking a chance when he entrusted various things to me, but he gave me, as a result, an opportunity to work alongside the very talented researchers and practitioners in this community, to learn a lot from him and to learn a lot from you. So, Pear, thank you for welcoming me into this community. It's really been a wonderful opportunity for my career. I'm sure others are aware that when it comes to disciplinary prejudice, Pear really doesn't have any. He will learn from, or he will communicate with people across disciplinary boundaries as well, or better than anyone else in the field. Now, I was asked for this project to address the question of who makes global food policy, and my answer as a political scientist is that food policy is not made at the global level. This is something that Pear has known all along. Pear routinely refers to the world food system as a collection of mostly separate national and local systems. He is exactly right. And nearly all of the policies that are powerful enough to shape production and consumption outcomes in the food and farming sector are made not globally, but they're made by national governments or by governmental institutions below the level of the nation state. And I know that this goes against the hopes of some aspirational Wilsonian global governance advocates who want and even expect national governments to yield their authority to institutions above the nation state, intergovernmental organizations like FAO or the World Food Program or IFAD, or perhaps at least to groupings of governments like the G8 or the G20. The leading role of national governments is a constant disappointment and frustration to these advocates of global governance. The leading role of national governments is also challenged by advocates on the political left, anti-globalization advocates, who see the world's food system as under the control not of national governments, or for that matter, intergovernmental organizations, but under the control of profit-making multinational corporations. But in my chapter in this book, I argue that no, it's not intergovernmental organizations, it's not multinational corporations, it's still national governments that are in control. Whenever intergovernmental organizations attempt to coerce national governments into doing something they don't want to do, the national governments prevail and the IGO has to back off. Usually IGOs know this and they don't try to coerce national governments into doing something they don't want to know. That's the way intergovernmental organizations preserve their appearance of authority. They never go to the mat with the national governments because they know that they'll lose. And when it comes to multinational corporations, their success rate in coercing national governments into doing something they don't want to do in the food and farming sector is almost as low. My paper provides some key examples to illustrate this tendency, starting with intergovernmental organizations. Now, let me start first with the weakness of the so-called the G20, the group of 20 governments that is frequently depicted as running the world today. But this is a collection of separate sovereign national governments that can't act unless all 20 agree to act. This is an organization that works by consensus. And so whenever it tries to do anything, it will encounter a veto. Look at the effort of the G20 when French President Sarkozy was in charge in 2011, it tried to impose new disciplines on commodities futures trading, and it was blocked. The United States, Britain, Canada, and Australia, kind of an Anglo-Saxon axis of countries, said absolutely not. We don't care about the financialization of commodities markets. We don't want any changes in the regulatory system. When the G20 tried to discipline biofuel subsidies, Brazil said, no, we don't want anything about that in the communique. When the G20 tried to impose restraints on export bans, the Russians, who just placed a restriction on exports of cereal grains, said, no, we don't want the communique to say anything about that. And so the G20 isn't an intergovernmental organization. It's a collection of national governments that has to operate by consensus, which gives any one national government a veto power. World Trade Organization is also crippled by a consensus decision-making rule. And as the number of economic powers that have to be satisfied has increased with time. I mean, back in 1944, when the Bretton Woods institutions were created, there were really, at most, two powers that had to be satisfied, the US and the UK. Well, by the 1970s, we had a G5. By the 1990s, we had a G8. Now we've got a G20. As the number of major economic powers has proliferated, the possibility of reaching a consensus in one of these organizations has tanked. We may never again see a successful completion of a multilateral trade negotiation on agriculture inside the WTO. The Doha round was supposed to be launched in 1999, and then it was finally launched in 2001. It adjourned without a result in 2008, and no one's talking seriously about reviving it. These global multilateral settings simply don't have the power or the authority to tell national governments to do something that they don't want to do. As for the World Bank, there was a time when the World Bank exercised considerable influence over food and farming policies, particularly in the poorest developing countries that were heavily in debt and needed the loans back during the structural adjustment era. Back in the 1970s, 30% of bank lending went to the agricultural sector, and that conferred some influence on lending officers at the bank. But that was then. The bank has essentially walked away from lending for agricultural development. By the time the agricultural lending share of the bank's portfolio had fallen from 30% down to 8%, in 2005, Bank President Paul Wolfowitz said, yeah, my organization's pretty much gotten out of the business of agriculture. So I would not describe the World Bank as a powerful global institution in the agricultural setting anymore. As for the Rome-based intergovernmental organizations like FAO, WFP, IFAD, it's true, every time there's a so-called world food crisis, national governments create more institutions in Rome, but they don't give them their own resources. They don't give them any authority. They create a new venue where summits can be held and communiques can be issued, but without any of the authority that's required to shape outcomes. I mean, the World Food Program is a wonderful organization, but it doesn't really have its own resources. It has to beg national governments for the cash or for the food that it then delivers as food aid, and sometimes it actually has to beg recipient country governments for permission to deliver the food aid. And sometimes it will encounter a government like in North Korea or in Myanmar that won't give them that permission. This is not a government that's powerful vis-a-vis, not an organization that's powerful vis-a-vis national governments. And when it comes to the FAO and the organizations within the FAO, the Committee on Food Security, here I have to be careful because I know Pair is going to be working in the years ahead with some of these organizations, with a high-level panel of experts in particular. But these organizations will produce, under your leadership, wonderful studies, but you will not have any authority to implement those studies, and you will not have a budget to implement those studies. They will run the risk of sitting there admired on a website, but otherwise stillborn. There are periodic food summits in Rome. They pass aspirational resolutions, but the resolutions are unfunded, and FAO has no authority to enforce these resolutions. In today's international political system, it's national governments that still have legally exclusive sovereign jurisdiction over the agricultural resources within their own borders and over the movement of agricultural products across their borders. And they often use that jurisdiction to keep foreign products out. They also have exclusive sovereign power to use taxes and regulations to mobilize resources within their own borders and then to spend those resources or not in the way that they prefer. These are enormous powers that are still being monopolized by national governments, powers that haven't been passed on to global governance institutions. So when it comes to policy battles between national governments and intergovernmental organizations, the national governments win every time. What about multinational corporations? Here, very quickly. I see quite a similar pattern. National governments prevail over multinational corporations as well. Look first at some of the big grain trading companies, the so-called ABCD companies, Archer Daniels Midland, Bunge, Cargill, Lewis Dreyfus. These companies do not control the world's food supply. They manage international trade, and the internationally traded component of the world's food supply is only about 10%. In some product markets like rice, only 6% of rice ever enters international trade. These are international trading companies that have a certain authority over international trade by virtue of their size, but they compete with each other, and they don't control food within the borders of countries. And their relative weakness is illustrated by the fact that what they want, they don't get. They would like a further reduction in barriers to trade in the Doha round. They didn't get that. The Doha round failed. They still deal with national governments that place restrictions on imports of staple foods in particular in pursuit of national self-sufficiency. These companies are not getting what they want. What about supermarkets like Walmart? They don't get what they want either. Take a look at what happened to Walmart in India just this last fall. They tried for 6 years to get multi-brand sales opportunities in India. The government of India held them up, finally said, well, you can come in if you source 30% of what you sell from India. Walmart knew that its competitors weren't going to be under that restriction, and so they gave up and walked away. And finally, what about the biotechnology companies, the seed patenting biotechnology companies? Here, I think here more clearly than anywhere else, the influence of multinational companies over governments has been badly exaggerated. Think about it. The biotechnology seed patents that can be registered in the United States are essentially worthless in the developing world, where national law does not make the patenting of seeds legal. And even if they had patents on seeds in developing countries, because of national biosafety systems and biosafety regulations, it's not yet legal to plant any biotech seeds in virtually the entire developing world, except for some cotton here and there. In all of the developing countries of Asia, the only country that's made it legal to plant any biotech food or feed crop is the Philippines, which permits maize, which is for animal feed, and just recently Bangladesh, BT brinjal, but we'll see how far that goes. In all of tropical Africa, it's not yet legal for farmers to plant any GMO crops, except in Burkina Faso and for cotton only. Throughout the developing world, national governments have told the biotech seed companies, no, our farmers will not be permitted to plant your food and feed crops within our territory, and they've had the authority to get away with that. In fact, even in the United States, it's astonishing to me how little progress the biotech companies have made in putting their products into our agricultural system. Think about it. In the United States, we don't plant any biotech wheat or any biotech rice. We used to plant potatoes, that's been withdrawn. We used to plant tomatoes, that's been withdrawn. The only fruits and vegetables is some papaya here and a little bit of summer squash there. All of the other food products for which biotech varieties are available haven't been commercialized because of consumer resistance. The biotech companies have lost virtually every battle in the United States when it comes to food crops. They've only made it with feed crops and industrial crops. And that's even without mandatory labeling. So I don't see, I see once again national governments in control. And let me just observe at the end that the dominant role of national governments over global food policy is something that Pear has emphasized consistently throughout his distinguished career, and I think to his great credit. He's not been lured into the global modeling world. He's not been lured into designing fanciful systems of global governance. He consistently studies the policy responses of national governments to food and nutrition problems. He's done that most recently in the new book that's going to be published by Oxford next year that Finn presented yesterday. This is a study not of what FAO did to the food crisis, not of what the G20 did. It's a study of what 15 separate national governments did. I appreciate the focus. I appreciate the discipline. I appreciate that perception. So thank you, Pear, once again.